Tonight, we step away from the turmoil of the present and drift back to a time when great change was born, not of chaos, but of quiet conviction. We journey to the 18th century, to a vast, peaceful land where farmers and thinkers first dreamed of a new republic. This story is not about the thunder of cannons, but the patience of the human spirit. Close your eyes. Let the soft sounds of a colonial evening envelop you, and relax as we explore the gentle yet profound story of how America found its independence. Before this video continues, I just want to say something from the heart. It takes me days of effort and sleepless nights to bring you these videos, but very few people subscribe. I'm honestly disheartened because every video I make is for you, to entertain, inspire, and give you something meaningful to watch. Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. Your support means everything to me. It's the only thing that keeps me motivated to work harder and bring you even better content every time. Before the cannons roared and the flags were raised, the American Revolution was simply the quiet rhythm of colonial life, a life rooted in the soil, the sea, and the unhurried pace of a vast new land. To truly appreciate the magnitude of the conflict, we must first slow down and settle into the calm before the storm. Imagine the year 1760. You are not a rebel or a loyalist. You are merely a colonial farmer in Massachusetts or a merchant in the bustling ports of Philadelphia. Your days are dictated by the sun and the seasons, a cycle of predictable, soothing labor. The air in the countryside is clean, often smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and the distant wood smoke scent of a neighbor's hearth. Life is hard, demanding, but possesses a deep sense of self-reliance. You rise before dawn, guided by the familiar weight of the axe or the feel of the milking pail. The loudest noise you might hear is the slow, rhythmic clack-clack of a loom from the cottage, the soft hush of wind through the tall corn, or the steady, reassuring thud of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from the nearest town square. Communication is slow and deliberate. News from London might take weeks or months to arrive, delivered by a weary rider or a ship pulling into harbor. This distance was a fundamental reality, fostering a sense of independence and self-governance that was organic and deeply rooted. Long before any politician spoke the word freedom, you are a subject of the crown. Yes, but primarily, you are master of your own patch of earth. This peaceful, slow-moving world is the stage upon which the great drama will be quietly set. The transition from peace to rebellion was not a sudden explosion, but a slow boil, characterized by years of legal disputes, petitions, and philosophical argument. The roots of the revolution lie in the subtle, yet deeply felt, violation of the calm, established norms of colonial life. The troubles began not with musket fire, but with parchment and ink. After the costly 7 Years' War, the British Parliament looked across the Atlantic for revenue. The decision was logical on paper. Colonials should help pay for the security they enjoyed. But for the colonist, who had long enjoyed a measure of fiscal autonomy, the sudden imposition of taxes from a distant body was an unsettling intrusion. Consider the Stamp Act of 1765. This tax was levied on every piece of printed paper, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards. It was an annoyance, yes, but the real disturbance was the principle: taxation without representation. The calm silence of the colonial printing shops and taverns was broken by hushed, indignant conversations. Men who once only discussed crop yields now spoke of Magna Carta and the rights of Englishmen. The protest was initially dignified and measured. Committees wrote petitions and eloquent letters to the king and parliament, carefully articulating their loyalty, but firmly asserting their rights. The colonists were not crying for revolution yet. They were simply demanding a return to the old ways, the established traditions of self-governance. The tools of resistance were not weapons, but boycotts. Merchants quietly agreed to stop importing British goods, creating a steady, subtle economic pressure. Imagine the silence on the docks of Boston and New York, where once bustling trade now stood eerily still. The loudest statement was the sound of empty ships sitting idle at anchor. This period was one of quiet, philosophical tension, where the most powerful weapons were the pen, the shared agreement, and the slow, deliberate turning of public opinion against the distant crown. The decade of simmering tension began to accelerate in 1774-1775, culminating in a night of profound suspense and quiet urgency. The moment the abstract philosophical conflict became a tangible military reality. The British military command, viewing the colonial resistance as criminal dissent, sent troops to seize stores of arms and ammunition hidden by colonial militias, Minutemen, outside of Boston. The movement of the British troops, scheduled for the darkness of night, was meant to be secret, swift, and overwhelming, but colonial intelligence was faster, carried not by telegrams or radio, but by the nervous energy of men on horseback. On the night of April 18th, 1775, a complex network of riders was activated. The most famous element of this network involved Paul Revere and William Dawes. The signal was subtle and tense. One if by land, and two if by sea. Two lanterns were briefly shown in the tower of the Old North Church, a silent, powerful warning visible across the water. Imagine the atmosphere of that night. The air is still and cold, broken only by the soft clip-clop of hooves on the dirt roads. Revere and Dawes did not shout their message. The mission was stealth, not spectacle. They rode through the sleeping countryside, pausing at farmhouses to deliver the quiet, urgent warning. The regulars are out. The farmers, who had prepared for this moment for years, rose silently. They didn't scream or panic. They retrieved their muskets and powder horns, dressed in the dark, and slipped out the back door, leaving their families asleep, unaware that the quiet rhythm of their lives was about to be broken forever. The revolution was carried on the night air. A whispered alarm passed from shadow to shadow, an exercise in calm, controlled mobilization. The culmination of this quiet preparation arrived at dawn on April 19th, 1775, a moment of profound significance that began with a devastating, short-lived silence. The British regulars, exhausted and frustrated by the leaked secrecy of their mission, reached the small village green of Lexington. There, drawn up in two ragged lines, stood a small company of roughly 70 Minutemen. The two forces faced each other in the early morning mist. The only sounds were the snort of the horses, the creak of the leather straps, and the heavy breathing of the nervous, exhausted men. This confrontation was not planned as a battle. It was a standoff. The colonial captain, John Parker, had ordered his men to assemble, but not to engage, stating, "Stand your ground." Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. For a tense, agonizing moment, neither side moved. Then, history records the sound that changed the world. The shot heard. Round the world. No one knows who fired the first round. A random nervous trigger finger, an accidental discharge, or a deliberate act of defiance. But once fired, the brief silence was shattered by a deafening, chaotic volley. The outnumbered, untrained Minutemen were immediately routed. The engagement lasted only minutes, leaving 8 colonists dead. It was a skirmish, a disaster, but the blood had been spilled. The philosophical argument was over. The British marched on to Concord, where they found the arms stores mostly moved. However, on their long, desperate march back to Boston, the true force of the colonial mobilization was unleashed. Thousands of Minutemen, alerted by the riders, now emerged from the woods, houses, and stone walls. This was not a formal army. It was a deadly, decentralized swarm. They did not fight in organized lines, but used the terrain, the trees, the stone fences, and the dense brush to their advantage. The continuous, terrifying sound of snipers' muskets popping from concealed locations turned the road into a gauntlet of death for the exhausted regulars. The day ended with the British suffering heavy casualties and the colonial militias, despite their losses at Lexington, having successfully laid siege to the city of Boston itself. The American Revolution had begun, not with a declared war, but with a terrifying silence, broken by a single, accidental shot, proving that the deepest conflicts often start with the quiet failure of diplomacy and the sudden, explosive sound of a single, unintended act. The calm of colonial life was over. The long, uncertain years of war had finally begun. The true nature of the American Revolution, the gritty, unforgiving reality of its survival, is best understood by focusing not on the brief triumphs of battle, but on the long, agonizing test of endurance known as the Winter at Valley Forge. This period, from late 1777 to early 1778, was a profound psychological and physical crucible that revealed the deep commitment of the Continental Army and the quiet strength of its leadership. Imagine the sheer, pervasive cold of Valley Forge. The location, a defensible plateau in Pennsylvania, offered strategic protection, but no comfort. The winter of 1777 was relentlessly harsh, marked by constant, bitter cold, often compounded by driving snow and icy rain. You are not a professional soldier with warm barracks. You are an American volunteer, and your shelter is a hastily constructed log hut, a crude, damp structure with mud and straw chinking the gaps, designed only to keep the worst of the elements at bay. The constant cold seeps into your bones, never fully leaving. The ground beneath your straw mattress is perpetually frozen, and the air inside the hut, smoky from the inadequate fire, offers only temporary, insufficient warmth. The physical endurance demanded was staggering. Thousands of soldiers lacked adequate clothing. Many wore mere rags, their worn shoes falling apart, forcing them to wrap their feet in strips of cloth or animal hide. The footprint of a bloody sock in the snow was a common, agonizing sight, a quiet testament to the soldier's commitment. Frostbite and exposure were constant, invisible enemies. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and uncomfortable, frequently interrupted by the need to tend the fire or stand watch in the biting wind. This was a war fought not just against the British, but against the sheer indifference of a brutal North American winter, forcing the human body to its absolute limits of cold and exhaustion. The cold was matched by the slow, crushing weight of quiet despair brought on by hunger and disease. Valley Forge was a logistical nightmare. While the surrounding countryside was rich with resources, the fledgling supply system of the Continental Congress had collapsed. Food did not arrive. Weeks passed, where the soldiers subsisted solely on fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked hard on a fire, or the meager, watery soup made from whatever scant meat could be foraged or hunted. This starvation was a demoralizing force. A man with an empty stomach and freezing hands struggles to believe in a cause. The illness that swept through the camp was deadlier than any British volley. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. The sound of hacking coughs and the sight of weak, emaciated men being carried to the crude field hospitals became the mournful backdrop to daily life. Over 2,000 men, nearly 1/4 of the entire force, died that winter, not in glorious battle, but quietly, coldly, and miserably from disease and hunger. Yet, in the midst of this misery, stood George Washington, the general whose most profound act of leadership was simply staying. Washington himself was housed in simple, cold quarters, often eating the same meager rations as his troops. His leadership was not defined by rousing speeches, but by calm, visible presence. He rode through the camp daily, a tall, imposing figure whose silence and steadfast demeanor served as a tangible symbol of commitment. He wrote desperate, powerful letters to Congress, demanding supplies and expressing his heartbreak over the suffering. Yet he never publicly showed doubt or defeat. Washington understood that in this desperate moment, the Army's morale rested on his own quiet consistency, his determination to keep the Army together, to avoid the temptation to let the dispirited men simply melt away to their farms, was the single greatest act of defiance against the British. The quiet strength and shared misery between the commander and his men forged an unbreakable bond, a realization that they were not just soldiers, but brothers in sacrifice. For much of the deep winter, the war itself seemed to come to a halt. Heavy snowfall would often cover the entire valley in a deep, insulating blanket of white, lending a strange, eerie silence to the world. These moments were a pause in the fighting, a chance to step back from the constant stress of potential conflict. The British, comfortable in their Philadelphia quarters, chose not to launch a major assault, believing the cold and starvation would do their work for them. This provided the Americans with a crucial opportunity for introspection and, more importantly, training. It was during this quiet, desolate period that a Prussian drill master, Baron von Steuben, arrived. He was a small, intense man who spoke no English, but he brought with him the rigorous, systematic discipline of European warfare. Von Steuben didn't train a tired, freezing army with shouting. He trained them with repetition, precision, and personal demonstration. He used a colorful translator and a calm, deliberate method to teach the soldiers to properly load their muskets, execute complex maneuvers, and wield their bayonets. The art of fighting in formation, the slow, rhythmic sounds of the new drill, the stomp of feet, the click of muskets, the sharp, foreign commands, cut through the despairing silence of the camp. This quiet, intense training transformed the Continental Army from a collection of militias into a cohesive, professional fighting force. The long, silent winter was thus not a waste of time, but a necessary incubation period. The physical suffering sharpened their resolve, and the methodical training honed their skills. The snow and cold provided the cover needed for the Americans to quietly rebuild and prepare for the spring campaign, ensuring that the suffering was a worthwhile investment in their future survival. Amidst the deep isolation of the American cause, one bright source of relief and encouragement arrived in the form of a young French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette represented more than just a volunteer. He was a whisper of hope, a tangible promise of the foreign aid that the fragile revolution desperately needed. Lafayette's arrival was initially met with skepticism by the pragmatists in Congress, but his immediate, profound commitment to the cause, his willingness to share the hardships, and his generous use of his own wealth to purchase necessities for the troops quickly won over Washington and the army. He was a symbol of the revolution's international appeal, a sign that the American struggle for liberty resonated far beyond the colonial shores. His quiet, genuine presence among the freezing, starving troops was a powerful morale booster. He was a European aristocrat who chose to sleep in a damp hut and share the meager rations, treating the common soldier with respect and warmth. He wasn't bringing thousands of French troops yet, but he was bringing the promise of French recognition, French money, and French ships. Lafayette's bond with Washington was deep and paternal, and his tireless advocacy in the following years was crucial in securing the massive French fleet and military support that would ultimately prove decisive at Yorktown. His youthful enthusiasm and quiet conviction acted as a psychological counterbalance to the prevailing despairs. He was the foreign proof that their suffering in the desolate, frozen Valley Forge was not in vain, but part of a grand, world-changing endeavor. The winter of endurance was survived not just by muskets and cold resolve, but by the quiet, shared strength of a great general and the optimistic whisper of a young French nobleman. The American Revolution is often recalled through the lens of land battles. Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown. Yet, the war's true, precarious nature was played out silently on the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and the shallow, coastal waterways. This was the naval dance, a war of a slow attrition, smuggling, privateering, and decisive, quiet maneuvers that determined the fate of the Continental Army and the entire Revolution. The Continental Army, chronically undersupplied and underfunded, relied heavily on an unofficial navy of privateers and smugglers, the shadow economy of the war. These were not official naval vessels. They were privately owned, fast ships given a letter of marque by Congress, essentially legal permission to act as licensed pirates against British shipping. Their objective was simple: harass the vast, slow-moving British merchant fleet, seize valuable cargo, and thereby cripple the enemy's logistics. This created a subtle, relentless economic warfare. Imagine the tension on the open sea. A small, fast American schooner, hiding in the coastal fog, suddenly bursting forth to intercept a rich British merchantman carrying desperately needed textiles, gunpowder, or rum. The skirmishes were often quick and brutal, but the overall effect was profound. Privateers captured thousands of British vessels, not only depriving the British Army of supplies, but also generating income for the struggling American cause. This shadow navy was a constant, unpredictable force, turning the tranquil ocean into a hostile, costly corridor for the British. The sheer difficulty and risk involved in maintaining these operations meant that the American cause was sustained not by government efficiency, but by the reckless courage and greed of these independent maritime operators. While privateers hunted, the official British Royal Navy, the largest, most professional navy in the world, imposed a quiet blockade on the major American ports like Boston, New York, and Charleston. This was not a war of open engagement. It was a slow, agonizing waiting game. The powerful British ships established a perimeter, denying the Americans crucial access to international trade and cutting off the flow of necessary weapons and supplies from foreign allies. The psychological toll of this blockade was immense. American leaders were constantly looking out to sea, anxiously waiting for supplies that might never arrive, knowing that every delayed shipment of powder or medicine meant more suffering for Washington's troops. The ships lying at anchor, their massive, silent presence dominating the harbor horizon, were a constant reminder of British power and the fragility of the American rebellion. This blockade turned the American coast into an economic choke point. However, the immense size of the North American coastline made the blockade inherently porous. Smugglers and determined captains became adept at using shallow coastal waters and relying on local knowledge to slip past the heavy, deep-draft British warships under the cloak of fog or night. This logistical cat-and-mouse game was a war fought with charts, compasses, and patience, where the most important victory was the silent arrival of a single ship carrying enough gunpowder to keep the Continental Army fighting for another month. The American Navy, small and inexperienced, needed a hero to break the psychological grip of British naval dominance, and they found him in John Paul Jones. Jones was a fierce, relentless commander whose exploits turned him into an American icon and a terrifying specter for the British Navy and public. His story is one of audacious courage, played out against the vastness of the northern seas. His most famous engagement in September 1779 encapsulated the defiance of the American cause. Commanding the aging French ship, the Bonhomme Richard, named after Benjamin Franklin's famous almanac, Jones took on the heavily armed British frigate, the HMS Serapis, off the English coast. The battle was chaotic, fought at incredibly close quarters, with the two ships eventually tangled together in a desperate, deadly embrace. When the British captain, seeing Jones's ship sinking and on fire, called out asking if he had struck his colors, Jones delivered his legendary, defiant reply, "I have not yet begun to fight." This moment, though fought with the thunder of cannon and the cries of men, was fundamentally about morale and will. Jones refused to acknowledge defeat until his ship was utterly destroyed. Through sheer force of will, his crew managed to board the Serapis and secure the surrender, even as their own ship sank. The battle was a tactical loss for the Bonhomme Richard, but a colossal psychological victory for the Revolution. proving that the small, young American Navy possessed an unbreakable fighting spirit that transcended the simple counting of guns and hulls. The ultimate decisive factor in the naval dance was the entry of the French fleet. After years of diplomatic wrangling, the French commitment, spurred by the American victory at Saratoga and the tireless work of figures like Franklin and Lafayette, became the game changer. France did not just supply ships, they supplied the crucial margin of naval superiority needed to challenge the Royal Navy. This naval intervention came to its climax in the Chesapeake Bay in 1781, leading to the siege of Yorktown. General Washington, having secretly marched his combined Franco-American army south, needed only one thing to trap the British General Cornwallis: control of the sea. The massive French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, arrived precisely at the critical moment. In the Battle of the Chesapeake, de Grasse's ships managed to repel a key British relief fleet, forcing it to turn back. This was the quiet, final maneuver that sealed the fate of the war, with the French fleet blocking any escape or resupply by sea, and Washington's army trapping Cornwallis on the land. The position of the British was rendered hopeless. The silence of the French ships in the bay, a powerful, unmoving wall against the sea, was more effective than any land-based assault. The subsequent surrender at Yorktown was not simply an infantry victory, it was a naval masterstroke. The American Revolution, which began with the quiet frustration over tax laws and was sustained by the courage of privateers, ended with the decisive, silent presence of a powerful foreign fleet. The sea was the ultimate arbiter of the conflict, and when the Royal Navy lost control of those vital coastal waters, the war was irrevocably lost. The American Revolution was won on battlefields, but it was conceived and justified in committee rooms, taverns, and printing presses. Before the call for independence became a physical fight, it was a profound, patient war of ideas and words. The true architecture of the new nation was drawn up not with bayonets, but with the steady stroke of the quill on parchment. The foundation of the intellectual conflict lay in the subtle, yet deeply felt, power of peaceful resistance. The colonists' first weapon against the tyranny of Parliament was not the musket, but the boycott and the eloquent petition. The passage of the Stamp Act, 1765, and the subsequent Townshend Acts of 1767, which taxed common goods like tea and glass, sparked immediate, collective civilian action. Imagine the deliberate, slow-moving consensus across 13 separate colonies, a remarkable achievement in itself. Merchants quietly agreed to stop importing British goods. The silence on the docks, where once bustling trade had thrived, became a powerful statement. More intimately, women across the colonies began forming the Daughters of Liberty, weaving their own homespun cloth and deliberately abstaining from imported tea. The rejection of the taxed British tea in favor of herbal substitutes became a quiet, domestic act of political defiance. This form of resistance was effective because it was nonviolent, moral, and economically devastating to the Crown's merchants. The colonists were asserting the power of their will and their wallets, proving that even a vast empire could be swayed by the quiet, unified refusal of its subjects to participate in their own subjugation. The revolution started with a simple refusal to drink tea. If the boycotts were the body language of the revolution, Thomas Paine's common sense was its fierce, beating heart. Published anonymously in January 1776, at a time when many colonial leaders were still clinging desperately to the hope of reconciliation with King George III. Paine's pamphlet was a revolutionary thunderbolt. It was a masterpiece of clarity and accessible prose, deliberately written in plain language so that it could be understood by the common man, the farmer, the artisan, the soldier. Paine was a radical who directly attacked the concept of monarchy itself. He didn't just criticize the king's policies, he called the king a royal brute and denounced the entire system of hereditary rule as absurd. His argument was a logical sledgehammer. Why should a continent be governed by an island? Why should Americans continue to suffer under a system that was clearly failing to serve their interests? The impact of common sense was instantaneous and massive. It sold an estimated 100,000 to 120,000 copies in the first few months, making it the best-selling document of the entire revolution. It was read aloud in taverns, meeting houses, and military encampments. It was the spark that ignited the public consciousness, converting millions of wavering colonists from resentful subjects into committed separatists. Paine's simple, powerful words dissolved the final psychological barrier to independence, demonstrating that the most effective weapon against an empire is often not a musket, but a clear, persuasive idea distributed widely enough to galvanize the masses. The true call to arms was a piece of cheap, revolutionary paper. Paine cleared the mental path, but the actual, final separation required the ultimate act of deliberate political will, the Declaration of Independence. The signing of this document in July 1776 was perhaps the most profound, quiet moment of the entire revolution, a decision made under the oppressive heat of a Philadelphia summer, with the delegates fully aware that they were signing their own potential death warrants for treason. The primary author, Thomas Jefferson, was tasked with synthesizing the scattered sentiments of the Enlightenment and the grievances of the colonies into one sublime, definitive statement. His writing was slow, methodical, and deeply philosophical. The document is famously divided. The eloquent, universal ideals about human rights and equality, self-evident truths, followed by a long, detailed list of specific grievances against King George III. The signing itself was a moment of profound, quiet suspense. It was not a celebratory flourish, but a deliberate, solemn commitment. The delegates affixed their names to the parchment, knowing that by that act, the war was irrevocably official, and their hope for reconciliation was extinguished. John Hancock's famously large signature was a gesture of defiance, designed so that King George can read it without his spectacles. This declaration was not a physical weapon, but an act of intellectual warfare, providing the new nation with a moral foundation and a clear, unified purpose that the haphazard colonial militias desperately needed. It shifted the war from a rebellion over taxes to a fight for the fundamental rights of humanity. The intellectual commitment to independence was immediately followed by the complex, tedious, and fragile effort to build a government on paper, the drafting and eventual ratification of the Articles of Confederation. This period, roughly from 1777 to 1781, was characterized by painstaking, often agonizing debate among the delegates, who were driven by two powerful, competing fears: the fear of tyranny, like the one they were fighting, and the fear of chaos if they couldn't unite. The articles were a document of caution and compromise. The delegates, deeply suspicious of centralized power, created a national government that was deliberately weak. The bulk of the power remained with the individual states, and the National Congress lacked the crucial ability to directly tax or enforce its laws without the consent of 9 out of the 13 states. Imagine the long, quiet hours spent arguing over seemingly small details that had massive consequences: how to count populations, how to settle state border disputes, and how to fund the war effort without granting Congress too much authority. The writing of the articles was the sober, often discouraging phase of the revolution, a necessary realization that the ideals of the Declaration were incredibly difficult to translate into a functioning, practical government. The weakness of the articles, born from the fear of a new King George, ultimately led to near collapse after the war, but their very existence proved that the intellectual leaders of the revolution were committed not just to fighting, but to the patient, frustrating work of creating a new constitutional order, a final, lasting act of faith in the power of the written word. The American Revolution was a fiery, decade-long conflict, yet its conclusion was marked by a series of quiet, profoundly important events, moments of restraint, diplomacy, and voluntary surrender of power that defined the future character of the young republic. The war ended not with a final, overwhelming victory, but with a slow, deliberate retreat back to the stability of peace and governance. The long struggle for independence came to its practical end at Yorktown in 1781. This final, decisive action was less a massive battle and more a brilliantly executed siege, culminating in a quiet conclusion. General George Cornwallis, the British commander, found himself trapped by the combined Franco-American armies on land and the overwhelming French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, blocking any escape or resupply by sea. The relentless, methodical siege, the slow digging of trenches, the creeping proximity of the Allied batteries, and the constant, dull thud of cannon fire made the British position utterly hopeless. On October 19th, 1781, the surrender ceremony took place. It was a moment charged with tension, yet executed with formal military precision. Cornwallis, unable to face the ignominy of surrender, claimed illness and sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to present his sword. The defeated British troops marched slowly between the lines of victorious American and French forces, their silence a powerful acknowledgement of their defeat. As the British officers approached Washington, he calmly directed them to his second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, subtly asserting the dignity and authority of the American command. This quiet, measured formality, the restraint shown by the victors, was the first psychological step back toward peace. The fighting was over. The laborious work of nation-building was about to begin. The final sound of the revolution was the slow, steady drumbeat accompanying the defeated troops as they laid down their arms. Following the victory at Yorktown, the new republic faced a crisis not from the defeated enemy, but from within its own army. The war dragged on for 2 more years, with sporadic fighting, and the Continental Army, unpaid and exhausted, grew restless. The officers, fearing that Congress would never honor its promise of back pay and pensions, gathered at their winter camp in Newburgh, New York, openly discussing a potential military coup against the fledgling civilian government. This was the moment when George Washington's true greatness was revealed, not in battle, but in a deliberate act of peaceful restraint. At the Newburgh meeting in March 1783, Washington arrived unannounced. He did not issue threats. Instead, he appealed to their honor, reminding them of the sanctity of their cause and the importance of civilian rule. As he struggled to read a letter, he paused and quietly put on his spectacles, remarking, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." This simple, profoundly human gesture, a display of humility and age, shattered the conspirators' resolve. It reminded the men of their shared sacrifice and the civilian nature of the revolution they fought for. By rejecting the opportunity to seize power when he was at the height of his influence, Washington set the indelible precedent for American democracy. The military must always yield to civilian authority. His ultimate, quiet act of service came in December 1783, when he formally resigned his commission before Congress and quietly returned to his farm at Mount Vernon. This voluntary surrender of immense power was an unprecedented event in the history of the world and was the most essential foundation stone of the Republic. While Washington was establishing civil precedent at home, American diplomats were concluding the formal end of the conflict in Europe. The process of negotiating the Treaty of Paris was a long, complex diplomatic dance that required patience and resolve, far removed from the clamor of the battlefield. The American delegation, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, worked quietly in Paris, navigating the competing interests of the British, the French, and the Spanish. The negotiations were characterized by a quiet, intellectual struggle. The Americans' primary goal was not just peace, but full and unconditional recognition of American sovereignty and the securing of vast new territory. The final treaty, signed in September 1783, was a triumph of American diplomacy. Great Britain not only recognized the independence of the United States, but also ceded control of all territory east of the Mississippi River, an enormous grant of land that instantly doubled the size of the new nation. The peace achieved was profound. It settled the boundaries, secured fishing rights, and opened the door to the economic future. But the treaty's real significance lay in its legitimization of the revolution in the eyes of the world. It signaled that the United States was a permanent, sovereign fixture on the global stage. This formal, quiet act of signing parchment was the final, undeniable closing chapter of the war, transforming the successful rebellion into an established nation. The great silent wait was over. The nation had earned its place at the table. With the war concluded and the peace treaty signed, the promise of the American Revolution finally materialized. The land of the free, the vast territory secured by the treaty, now opened up a silent, immense frontier for exploration and settlement. The soldiers who survived the war returned not to a settled utopia, but to a vast, uncertain future filled with both hope and profound challenges. The true work of the revolution, the creation of a lasting constitutional government, was yet to come, culminating in the quiet, methodical drafting of the Constitution in 1787. But the immediate result was a newfound freedom from external control. The rhythmic sound of the farmer's plow, the quiet creak of the wagon moving west, and the thoughtful silence of the town meeting debating local laws now replaced the sounds of battle. The legacy of the American Revolution's end is defined by its restraint and intellectual commitment. It proved that a revolution could conclude not with the ascension of a new dictator, but with the quiet, voluntary ceding of power back to the people. The long, bloody war found its resting place in the solemnity of law and the silence of a continent now open for the hard, quiet work of self-governance. The ultimate victory was not the capture of a general, but the patient, enduring belief in the quiet power of civilian government. And so, we leave the young nation secure in its new peace, as the long, uncertain war finally fades into history. Let the sounds of the battlefield vanish, completely replaced by the quiet permanence of freedom. The struggle is over, the papers are signed, and the leaders have gone home. Your mind is now free to follow their example, to let go of the day's burdens, and find a quiet, certain rest. You are safe now. The journey is complete. The night is deep, and the peace you have earned is yours. Breathe slowly, and drift into a deep, gentle sleep.